Why is fake news and conspiracy so captivating? And how does our shared tribal psychology make us more susceptible to misinformation and ethical blindness? In this conversation, I speak with Philipp Huebl, who's a visiting professor in philosophy and cultural studies at the Universität der Künste in Berlin. We discuss the role that a shared morality plays in shaping our society, the connection between morality and our emotions, and the spread of political division and fake news. I'm Shane Farnsworth, and this is the Escape Sapiens podcast. These conversations are supported by the Andrea von Braun Foundation. If you enjoy what I'm doing, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this content. And now, I'm pleased to bring you Philipp Huebl. I hope you enjoy.
Escape Sapiens.
So I have to, first of all, thank you for being the very first person to come face-to-face for one of these interviews. It takes courage.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so welcome on the podcast.
Thanks.
I want to start off with, since you teach philosophy, what I want to know is, do you have any questions, moral dilemma questions, that you really enjoy asking the students?
Many of them. One is a couple of questions actually posed by moral psychologists who want to find out why people give certain moral judgments. And one is made up by Jesse Graham and Jonathan Haidt, two influential moral psychologists, and they did an experiment. They asked, they used harmless taboo stories and asked people about what they think about the story. And one story goes like this, short version: there's a couple, there are siblings, a male and a female sibling. They're adults, and they both cannot have children, but on a summer day they decide to have sex as adults and as siblings. And nobody knows about this, nobody will ever find out. They do it just one time, and it brings them closer together. They're not traumatized or anything by it. And now you ask the subjects in your experiment, is it morally reprehensible what they did, or is it morally okay what they did? And many people, the majority, say no, it's not okay what they have done. And then they ask the subjects, so why is that? What is the reason? Why is it not okay what they've done? And then they make up reasons why it's not okay, and that these reasons typically involve harm. They say, what if a child comes out of this sexual intercourse? And then they say, no, but this is, in this experiment, is excluded. It cannot happen. What if someone knows about this? No, nobody will ever find out. And then people in the end say something like, well, I cannot explain it. I cannot give a rational explanation why it's wrong, but it feels wrong. And this is interesting because people, it shows that we quite often, probably, we make a moral judgment about a certain violation without having a rational principle, a general principle that sort of can explain why we find it's wrong. And even more interesting, when you talk to these people a long time, some of them say, I think 20 or 30% change their mind. So it also shows not only that first we are very we have basic, probably emotional inclinations that give us sort of a moral gut feeling, and we cannot even explain it. This is surprising. But also there's some hope that you can change your view if someone gives you rational arguments, and in the end you find out, maybe I have this feeling that's wrong, but if I really think about it rationally, then it doesn't seem to be so wrong at all.
Do you still get surprised by the students' answers, or are you at a point now in your career where you can be pretty sure of the space of answers that you're going to get from people?
I have to say that with this experiment, I did this quite often in seminars, and very often people, the majority says it's wrong, and in the end of the seminar, if you do it again after having 10 or 12 sessions on moral psychology or moral philosophy, most of them actually changed their minds. But there are some other examples, the famous trolley cases, where people have very different intuitions, and people sometimes have, even in the classroom, you're surprised that sometimes people say it's a clear case of this and that, or it's a clear case of the other side. So it's not so clear cut, I think, always straight away. Yeah.
But can you, for example, so if you knew a little bit about me, my educational background, you knew what sex I am, what gender I am, and so forth, could you be reasonably sure that you'd know, I also come from the West, what my response would be? How well can you predict?
I think it's very hard to predict on single cases because individuals are so complex. But if you do predictions on average, you could say, for example, that in the West, people are not as much appalled by these taboo violations as in other parts of the world. So there are many studies now, cross-culturally, worldwide studies on morals. And you could, for example, show that all the topics that surround the idea of purity, sanctity, and holiness, so that there are some acts which are impure. For example, one typical example is, and other acts are pure. So one example is, in many countries, heterosexual sex between a married couple is morally okay. It's sort of an idea of pure love or real love or a natural conjunction or natural situation, whereas other forms of sexuality, say masturbation, homosexuality, hookup culture, are deemed as unnatural or at least as not pure or not clean. We know this from, even in the West, from very religious people on the right in Western countries tend to be more, for example, more homophobic. But in other parts of the world, it's more common to think of certain sexual acts as morally wrong, whereas we in the West tend to think that sexuality in most parts, as long as nobody's hurt, is a sort of an expression of ourselves or a part of our autonomy and should be up to the individuals who engage in intercourse.
So it makes me wonder, what's the function of morality? Because when you bring up examples like masturbation, where in my mind it's pretty clear that doesn't hurt anyone. I can't even think of examples where that might be harmful to people. At least when you're on your own.
If privacy. You do it too often, it can be harmful.
Too often or in the wrong places, perhaps. But so, what's the function of morality, and why are there these standout cases that don't seem to have any function at all?
So of course it's a big question, and you can only sort of hint at the answer. But there's some idea in sort of evolutionary psychology to think of morality more like an adaptation of the human mind, and some parts of morality, of course, are provided by culture. But if you contrast this with ethics, I think you get a good view why sometimes everyday morality seems to us strange, and maybe to others our morality seems strange. So in ethics, in the sort of the science of morality in philosophy, you want to find universal principles of our morals from which you can deduce the morality or the moral status of particular actions. So you have universal principles, say the human rights, and every time someone does something, you ask yourself, is this in accordance with the human rights or in accordance with the law? And if not, it's sort of a non-moral act that we should sanction and even sanction in some way or other. But if you look at everyday morality, it's more messy. Of course, we don't judge from universal principles as Immanuel Kant would have proposed. We don't do this in everyday life. We have more like an everyday morality. And then the research shows that this is very often influenced by our emotional dispositions we have. And these emotional dispositions make us inclined to judge certain acts as immoral, even if they are on second looks not immoral at all. And everybody agrees worldwide that if a harm comes to a person, that's false. So if I kill someone, that's a harm, or if I take something away from him or her, if I rob someone, or if I hit someone, this is obviously a harm, or insult someone, this is a harm. And this is sort of banned in every society. It's almost never okay to do this. But if you look at violations that are more against the community or against these purity or sanctity rules, these are really not so individualistic. You cannot really say that an individual is harmed, but it's more that the principles of the community are harmed, or even principles of purity. And then when we come back to this case of masturbation, of course, when you look at the Western societies who look at autonomy as their main sort of moral value, you would say an autonomous person can do whatever he or she wants with his or her body. But if you look at other cultures where you say we have a certain idea of purity and sanctity of acts, and if you do this and you touch yourself, it's a bit more like animal-like behavior. It's not pure because you don't use your sexuality to have children, but only to pleasure yourself. Even Immanuel Kant said you use yourself as an object. He was against masturbation as well, so it's not so uncommon even in the Western tradition. Then you think there's a certain other principle that is violated. And sometimes we are very individualistic in the West. For us, self-expression is very important and individual autonomy. This is why we sometimes find it very strange that people have rules that, for example, are very community-based. In many cultures, it's important to do what the parents say. We, of course, value our parents, but we choose a career path that fits our interests, not our parents' interest. Or disobeying higher authorities is very important in some countries. Say in the Arab world, you have to be very respectful in front of the elderly, and it would be nice if we had the same here in Germany or in the Western world. But we are not as respectful when it comes to age. If someone has merit, we are more respectful. But if someone's just old, that gives not a special that doesn't afford a special treatment when it comes to moral respect. So these are sort of the differences. Is it more autonomy, community, or sanctity? And community and sanctity is more in the non-Western countries. Autonomy is more important in the more Western countries. And if I may add, all societies move towards this more individualistic culture. So there's a lot of research from Ingelhard. Ronald Ingelhard was one of the leading political scientists, one of the most quoted scientists, and he made up the World Value Survey. For 40 years, he and his colleagues did research on the values of all areas of the world, all countries of the world, and they found out that all cultural areas or countries or groups tend to do two movements once they become more industrialized and more they become richer as countries. So one movement is they're going away from religious rules that govern everyday life into more like a secular view of the world, where religion is still part of society but not dominating the rules of society, so more secular like we had in the West. And the other movement is going away from these more community-like collectivist rules that give you a certain place in the collective, in the family or in the society, towards more self-expression values, towards more individualism. So in collective societies, materialism is more important: to be safe, to have enough to eat, to have a shelter, to have access to water. And if this all is secured, people can be more expressive, they can do more what they want, and they become more individualistic. And this movement you can see even in the very authoritarian areas of the world, China or the Arab world, which are more authoritarian than, say, the Scandinavian countries. Even when you look at the young generation there, they are more individualistic already and more secular than the generation before and before.
So the West then is not an anomaly. You expect that as time goes on that cultures become more and more Western as they control their external circumstances.
Yeah, I think even the dichotomy between Western and Eastern, or global North and global South, is misleading, because it suggests that certain values are values that are Western in itself, only because they were developed or formulated or written down in a Western country. So a good counterexample is the Declaration of Human Rights is something that is certainly formulated and written down in the Western cultural area, but almost all countries signed the declaration and believe in human rights. So it's not a Western idea to have equality and fairness and protection from wrongful prosecution, discrimination by gender, race, ethnicity, and so on. I mean, these are sort of universal rights everybody has, even if they are sort of discovered, so to say, in the West. It's a bit like saying that mathematics is Indian because in India, or it's Persian because in these areas, or Sumerian because in these areas the first mathematicians put down, or Greek because geometry is Greek because of Euclid. It's a bit it's a strange assumption, but the view can be made for this. There's an anthropologist who says the Western countries are weird countries, and it's acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. And he says whole psychology is actually, Henrik is his name, Henrich geschrieben, I think Henrik is the pronunciation. And he wrote actually a book about the cultural evolution of the West and how we became so weird, what's different for the Westerners. And he made the observation that when we do certain experiments in psychology, we always ask grad students from elite institutions at the coasts of the US. And then we sort of extrapolate or infer from these samples to the mental setup of the whole world population, which of course is wrong. And now when we look at these experiments done again in other areas of the world, we find a lot of variance. But in fact, there's a tendency towards more individualism when people and societies become more secure. So in a sense, certain moral systems are an answer to a environment. And if you have an environment that's dangerous, food scarcity, infectious diseases, violent people on the streets, you tend to be more conservative and traditional because you stick more to your own, you're a bit more careful, you're wary of your surroundings, and you're also more loyal to your group, and you want to have rules and structure. You cannot be so liberal and open because it's dangerous. The more secure the environment is, the easier it is to be very open when it comes to sexuality, to immigration, to new ideas, to new food, new people. You can try out anything because it's secure. Otherwise, it's better as a strategy to stick to your own.
So you can think of morality as sort of a tool of cohesion within a group. And so the question then comes along, when you meet someone who has a different moral system to yourself, should you then try to empathize along those lines, even if they believe in things that you may think morally abhorrent? If you know that it's there as sort of a defense mechanism, does that give you a new perspective on how you should treat the different morals of different groups, even if you think they might be horrible?
Yeah, it's really hard to the first thing is it's really hard to change your own moral view, because we have something like a moral identity, and we want to, as you said it, we want to protect it. So we have this identity protective cognition that I have a certain worldview, and if now someone say, I think I'm pro-immigration because I think it's great, it's cultural exchange. Now someone confronts me with the disadvantages of immigration. He says, look at the criminal rate is going up. There's it's a stress to our social system. He lists all these sort of disadvantages. And in a rational discourse, I would weigh pros and cons and find sort of a mid ground. But if I have a strong moral view on this topic, it could be any other topic, I just chose this one, then I will tend to oppose this challenge from my opponent, and either I oppose it by saying, well, it's not true, I don't believe you, or it's you exaggerate, or I might even attack his or her character, because I might say, you're only saying this because you are you hate foreigners, or you're racist, or you're right wing, and this is why I don't talk to you. So it's really typical that people, when they are challenged in their moral views, that they tend rather to oppose the challenge as to weigh the different arguments. In an ideal rational discourse, you would always weigh the arguments.
Is that because, in a certain sense, morality, you said that morality sort of derives from some emotional set in your personality.
Yeah.
And so because of that, and you want to signal it in some sense to the group, right?
Yeah.
And so it makes sense to blurt out what you think is the correct answer, because you don't want to show that you're wavering. You want to show that you're standing. It's sort of like it's virtue signaling or something along these lines.
I think this is an additional effect. So even if you don't virtue signal, if nobody else is watching, you still have a very strong moral identity. And even if you talk to someone and nobody's watching, you want to protect your moral identity, and it's hard to change the view, because it's part of. I don't even think that my morals only derive from emotions or emotional dispositions, sentiments, as we say it in philosophy. I think we have a dual system. We have our moral emotions, sentiments, but we also have what we have learned, and we have reflection, and we can change our morals. It sometimes happens. People become vegetarian, or people used to be homophobic, and then think about it, and after a while they are less homophobic. And moral progress is only possible because we and our parents or grandparents somewhere along the lines changed their view from a more, say, narrow moral view to a more universalistic or liberal moral view. But what sort of adds to this identity protective cognition is that if I think people are watching me, or my group is sort of behind me, especially in social media where everybody can see the interaction, I have to have two interactions. First, I'm talking to my opponent, and second, I know I'm sending signals to other people watching me. So, and then I'm very often in a dilemma. Maybe I maybe I find it convincing that 50% what he or she is saying is not so wrong, and I'm maybe even on the verge of changing my mind in a certain position, but then I know I have to send unambiguous signals to my friends and my group, even if it's a virtual group and I haven't really met them. But I imagine this group watching me, and I want to send very clear signals to them. So I will tend to, as you put it, I will tend to stand my ground and be even more extreme in my views to leave nothing to interpretation. And this is a dynamic you find especially on social media that is one explanation for a sort of a tribal discourse, maybe not tribalism or maybe not polarization in the real world, but at least in the way we present ourselves in the self-presentation in the public discourse, that people tend to exaggerate their position, and the positions become more polarized, although everybody started quite narrow, but then you have to be a bit more extreme than the other, and then you have something that's sometimes called virtue signaling, or even more recent now, moral grandstanding, sort of a display of moral judgment, not to solve a moral problem or to discuss a moral problem, but only to present yourself towards others.
It makes me wonder about, since this is sort of a signal.
Yeah.
You know, peacocks have this huge tail, which is costly.
It's costly signal.
It's a costly signal. And if this is if you're, by your moral position and by your sort of quick response and cutting away sort of logical arguments, but really focusing on the emotional underpinning, I wonder if then there's some sort of value or whether there's sort of a push towards ideas that are in some sense crazy, because then you're showing the group you're willing. Is there something along these lines?
Yeah, it's exactly what costly signaling theory says. So it's still disputed whether what are the mechanisms of say status display. But one theory, costly signaling, says if for example in the animal kingdom, if a male wants to impress the female when it comes to sexual selection, this is the second mechanism towards natural selection. Darwin said there's natural selection, survival of the fittest, but also he's observed that there are some traits that they're not very helpful for natural selection. The peacock is the best example. It has long feathers, makes the peacock very slow when predators arrive. So why is it good for the peacock to have long feathers? And Darwin suspected that it has to do with sexual selection. The long feathers signal the female that he is a very strong exemplar of his species, and he can afford the long feathers. So he's so strong and so can fly so fast that even with the long feathers, he is fit. And this signal sort of impresses apparently the female peacock. And then you can now extend this idea towards, and this was done towards anthropology, and you can ask, why do we sometimes in religion say absurd stuff and people really adhere to these absurd principles? And one explanation could be, well, I signal to my peer group that I'm first very committed because I believe what you believe, and I'm even so committed that I do stuff that is hurtful. For example, initiation rite, initiation rite, where I have to endure pain or whatever, or which is really dangerous. This is sort of a signal. But also if I believe stuff that everybody else would say it's crazy. So there's a burning bush that talks to me, and we know bushes cannot talk, and burning bushes cannot talk either. So it's really crazy to believe that a burning bush can talk to me. But in the Bible, there's this one part where the bush talks to Moses. And so in taking this literally, I can really send a very strong commitment signal, loyalty signal to my peer group. I'm willing to say this, although people will laugh at me if they're not in my group, because I'm so committed to the group. And then you can extend this, and sometimes you have other moral groups who have extreme views on the world, but you sort of, they are more accepted because they are taken as signal of belonging, and it's important for human beings to belong to a group.
You said a while back that it's hard for people to change their morals, but when you change groups, you want to belong to the new group. In those circumstances, so for example, you join the military and now you go off and shoot people. How quickly do morals change once you change your surroundings, and how far away is any member of society from committing sort of moral atrocities on large scale? How quick can we be pushed into?
I mean, there's a lot of research on violence, And military is a very good example. I went to the military, German military training, so the basic.
It was compulsory.
It was compulsory in my age. You could choose civil service, but I, for reason, not because of commitment, but because it was shorter, I chose military service. And I read, I think it was Goffman, so a sociologist, who talked about the change of cynical behavior to authentic behavior. And the idea is that first, if you're in a new group, you have certain rules, you do it because you have to do it. So shining your shoes, getting into line. And we all did this sort of with a ironic distance. But after a while, I observed that 2 months later, many of the other soldiers, the young kids, boys, they internalized 100% these rules, and they were even sometimes sort of accusing me that I was lying in the bed because I was not allowed to lie in the bed, or that my shoes were dirty. And I thought 2 months ago, we all found this so ridiculous, we made jokes about it, but 2 months later, what I just read a year ago in Goffman, I think it was Goffman or some other sociologist, just happened there. And then you can see that these many studies people do on conformity and authority. The most famous study is the Milgram experiment. It's sort of flawed for different reasons. We now know, but follow-up experiments sort of basically showed that if there's an authority who says, I take responsibility, people are much more willing to do morally brutal acts, even hurting others, even endangering their lives. And the same is true with conformity. If all the others in the group do the same, there's this famous experiment by Solomon Asch. So you're in a room, there are 11 other people, you have to say there's a long and a short line, and you see a third line and say, is it the short or the long one? You're absolutely sure it's the short one, but all the others say it's the long one.
Yeah.
And then if you're the last in the line, people tend to say, oh yeah, it's the long one. We don't really know whether they change their mind or whether they just say what everybody says not to be different from the group. But it really takes some character and some will to oppose to the majority rule or the majority view. And if you take this together, you have, I think, two puzzle parts to explain extreme forms of violence in genocides, for example, that people very quickly are able to kill others. Normally we have a tendency not to kill others. We are very, it's really hard for us to harm others. But this sort of natural, how would you say, the natural impediment we have, or like a censor, like someone in our head saying you shouldn't harm others, you can override this by these mechanisms. And the third mechanism, which is sort of connects to what we talked before, is disgust. So disgust is also a moral emotion. Disgust is probably from the evolutionary point of view, a mechanism that helps us to avoid contamination by parasites or bacteria or viruses from rotten food or corpses or people who have illnesses. But disgust is also a mechanism that can be used to interrogations. So I can compare my enemy with animals, vermin, bacteria, or non-human entities to make them look subhuman or non-human. And then many experiments show it's easier then, once you view the opposing group as non-human, as not deserving of your respect, it's easier to apply force to them.
You make me worry that, so with the experiment, when the people that were part of the experiment were saying that's the short line or that's the long line, even contrary to what they were seeing right in front of them, it makes me wonder or worry what's bubbling under the surface in every society. So my imagination is that no one really wants to commit genocide, but it'd be hard to know that, right? If that's, it could be that this is sort of like an underlying feeling in the population that can be easily sparked.
Yeah.
Or it could be just a group phenomena. Do you think it's more the second?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, there's so many factors that, there's research in history, and there's a lot of research on areas of the world which are not governed by the rule of law. So this is sort of a factor that already Hobbes saw. If you don't have a strong state that enforces the rules by police or military, it's easier for people to commit crimes because they don't fear punishment. Also there are these group mechanisms. There are also studies that show that it's easier in totalitarian systems for psychopaths to go through the ranks. So if you have, once you establish a brutal dictatorship, people who are already prone to violence and are just kept in check by the laws can now roam freely and use their sadistic tendencies, and they even get rewarded for it. So there are many interlocking factors. It's really hard to tell, but I think one important factor is the surrounding. People change their view or their behavior in accordance to others, but also it gives us hope that some people are not at all affected by this. So we know this from dissidents during the National Socialist era who were totally against the main view. There are experiments that show when once a dissenting voice is raised against some action, people very often change their views because they're undecided. There's always an undecided middle position. People who don't really know and don't have a strong moral compass that guides them in one or another direction. So it's a complicated phenomenon.
So, from what you've said, I picture your view is that there is such a thing as moral progress. That you really can make absolute statements. Yeah. There are other philosophers that say that's really not the case, right?
Yeah, true.
So why is it your position that that you think? Yeah. What's your defense of absolute statements?
I don't have a good answer, to be honest. It's really hard, but it's really hard to argue for moral realism. So moral realism is the view that there are moral facts. So it's a fact that 2 + 2 is 4 equals 4, or it's a fact that an electron is charged, has a negative charge, as you probably know better than I do, and a spin of a 1/2, I guess. I don't know what it means, but I just learned this. So, but there are empirical facts and there are mathematical facts, and of course there are social facts, like Paris is the capital of France. Could be other way around. It could be different, but it's just a social fact of our time, or that certain colored paper counts as money is a social fact. And now you could say, probably there are also moral facts. So you shouldn't hurt someone just for pleasure. Probably is a moral fact. So, but now it's really hard to argue for this because you don't really know where what are the truth makers. Normally you have a sentence and you look somewhere else that makes the sentence true. So for empirical facts, you look at the nature. And if nature is the way you describe it, you have a truth maker. Nature makes the sentence true. And for mathematics, maybe you have an abstract realm of entities that makes mathematical statements true. It's already very debated. It's harder to argue for realism in mathematics. But then in moral reason, where does it come from? And some people say maybe it's self-evident. If you're rational, it must be self-evident. And some people say, no, it's sort of maybe you have to derive it from other facts, but it's really hard. But I think the basic intuition that there must be something. I mean, it's not. I think my standard example is if you talk to someone and say, look, we are driving on the right-hand side in Germany, but in England you drive on the left-hand side. But it's sort of a convention. It could be other way around. No harm is done. You can do it either way. So this is sort of a convention in the basic sense of convention. And it seems at first blush that morals are the same. We now say it's wrong to kill to kill someone if he has raped someone else. So we don't have death penalty, but in other countries we do have it. So it's just a convention, like driving on the left and the right hand side. But in a sense, this is not true, because we don't care about driving on the one side or the other, but we really care about not killing someone. And it's not, we don't have the impression it could be either way, or it's just so morality demands universality, as Immanuel Kant has proposed in many others too. We think it's more like a universal principle that's behind it, but it's really hard to put it in words. I don't have a good argument. I'm not even a moral philosopher, so I'm not an expert. I'm more an expert I work on the foundations of psychology. So moral psychology is more what I'm interested in. But even if I ask the top moral philosophers of my trade and ask them, what are your arguments? It's even really hard for them. The last word is not spoken. You don't have a knockdown argument that really moral facts exist. And the opposing camp are moral relativists who say, it's even more complicated, because some people would say, well, moral statements cannot be true or false because they don't have a truth value. But the most extreme case is to say they're very relative. Morals are very relative, and every society has them. And then you cannot really talk about moral progress, because it's just moral change. Progress sort of somehow implies that it's better now, but whether it's better is up to debate for a relativist. But I think even those people do not really live by their relativism. So they don't find it right if I kill their children and then justify it by saying, look, I have a different morality, survival of the fittest. They were not strong enough. We all have sort of an idea that certain kinds of harm are false for some reason, even if we disagree on what exactly fairness is or justice is. We have these disagreements, but in the basic outlook, we seem to have similar. So it's a long-winded answer to say I don't really have an argument. It's more like an intuition pumping.
Well, my intuition says that maybe the important thing is measurement, right? You might be able to say something along the lines of, this set of moral rules in this circumstance for this society will make the society more successful.
Yeah.
You might be able to make absolute statements like that. Maybe that's the best you can do.
Yeah. But successful already is a ambiguous term. The problem is, if you want to deduce moral statements from natural statements, you have to bridge a gap, because statements about how the world is statements don't have normative terms in them. So I can describe the world atom by atom, how the world is, but I don't know anything about how the world should be, ought to be, or what is good or bad. So if to go from a pure description of the world to a evaluation, to use normative terms like good or bad, or fair or unfair, generous, or what you ought to do, or what you should not do, I have to bridge this gap. And sometimes people try to argue from here to here. It's called typically called the naturalistic fallacy by Moore. Moore said you cannot derive ought from an is. It's actually David Hume already had a little passage in his writings where he said you cannot derive an ought statement from an is statement. And there's, of course, some people say maybe you can, if you really look at the world. For example, emotions maybe have an evaluative aspect. So an emotion is something that just happens to you, but the emotion itself is evaluative because it says this is dangerous or this is good, and maybe you can derive morals from these emotions. This is a new movement, emotionism. It's called. Jesse Prince is one of the leading philosophers who has written a whole book in arguing that this maybe is possible. but sometimes you're deceived by words like successful or natural, because successful can be used in a purely descriptive sense. Say a species was successful because it survived and the other was not.
Their biomass went up. Or
yeah, it's just in a quantitative natural sense. But you could also say successful has a normative feel to it, good in the sense of good, and then the normative sense is something you add to it. It's more clear in the case of natural. So we talked about this, what sexuality is natural, unnatural. So in one sense, natural has a descriptive meaning. If you say something like, a human being can only develop if a male and a female have intercourse, if an egg and a sperm cell come together. So the natural, in the sense of what happens in nature, process is this to get another human being. But then sometimes natural is then used in the normative sense, where people say it's unnatural that there's homosexuality. And then they mean it not in the sense of the functional sense of biology, but in the normative, moral sense of it's wrong, it's morally wrong.
Or what they used to.
Yeah, or they used to say this. Yeah. And I think many of these terms are double agents. So you don't really realize that you change from one to the other. And maybe successful, it could be that this is a term that sort of has two sides. It's like a double agent too.
For people in our society so we have this moral framework that sort of we sort of navigate through, and it sort of pushes our society in different directions. What does that look like for people who don't feel emotions in the normal way? So for example, if you look at psychopaths in society, if our morals are really based on our emotions or some underlying set of emotions, is the world extremely confusing? Is it really infuriating to be someone like a psychopath? Is this what leads to the murders?
It's a really tough question. I'm not an expert on psychopath, but in a sense you could say they are morally diminished because they don't feel remorse, as far as I know. Sort of, this is lay knowledge, like from books. But if they don't feel remorse in the sense we feel, and if they're not, if they don't have empathetic concern, so they have social intelligence, they can manipulate people, they know what they think, but they don't feel. So this is sometimes called empathetic concern, like a feeling into the others. So social intelligence, yes, but not concern. And if they don't have this, and it's at the core of many of our judgments, if I see a kid crying, I'm trying to help the kid or comfort it or find the mother. If they don't have this natural impulses, their moral, emotional sort of panoply is diminished in a sense. And sometimes you read that like real psychopaths treat others more like objects, not as real people with a full autonomous personality. So it could be that in a sense the world is not made for them, the moral world, because for them the world is a world of objects, and some objects are talking and moving objects and others are non-moving objects. But to be precise, you have to know more about psychopaths. I'm not sort of an expert on this, but there are of course some philosophers who say this is, if you base everything on emotions, then a psychopath of course is in a sense not like a person who cannot count. So mathematic is possible to learn, but if you have never learned how to count, then you cannot acquire all the other strains of mathematics either. And maybe this person is just, or maybe the person can count but not calculate a logarithm. So it has a certain limit towards his or her, mostly his, moral expression.
It's funny that you said his, because I was about to ask you.
No, psychopaths are more. This I know from what I've read, that they are more prevalent in among males than females.
Well, I wanted to ask. In our society, there's this whole idea. Men don't cry. People say that men have sort of a suppressed set of emotions, and how does that play out morally speaking, do males and females have very different moral systems? Can you measure the difference by, for example, asking these moral dilemma questions?
Yeah.
How does that look?
There are in some areas there are differences. I think it would be a great project for a book to gather all the experiments. I only know a few, but one clear difference you can find in social dominance orientation. So people who are on the very right-wing extremist view, who also are more prone to violence, tend to have this social dominance orientation. It's a view of the world that there are some groups who are better than others, and they even go so far to say, then these lesser groups, you can even use force or even maybe violence, strong forms of violence to suppress these other groups. And the studies show that these sort of personality characteristic is much more, can be found more often among men than women. It's almost entirely made up of men. The view that there are other groups who are not really as worthy as the own group. Whereas when you look at authoritarianism, so that's the view that there should be an authority, and either I'm the authority, or if I'm not, then I will go into my position in the vertical hierarchy, the vertical social hierarchy. And this is quite similar, male and female. And it could be one reason why very extremist parties, say right-wing populist parties, have more male voters. It's in Germany the case, I think in Austria and France, but in many countries you could see that the right-wing parties are more male and the more progressive green parties have a bit more female. If you look at personality traits, there's one personality trait called agreeableness. That means you like harmony, you don't like confrontation, you want to live in a society of respect, and you have a very strong tendency to empathetic concern. And this is significantly stronger among female subjects than male subjects. And empathy is sort of, Jesse Graham and Jonathan Haidt call it care, the care foundation. One of the moral foundations we have might be caring for those who are oppressed or marginalized or in need, for example, children or the elderly or people who are in marginalized groups. And this care foundation is fueled by empathetic concern for those who need our help. And this is maybe the reason why the left-wing parties have a bit more female supporters, because this care foundation is a bit stronger in female subjects than in male subjects. This is one difference.
I don't really have a good segue into this, but just would you be able to sort of flesh out the 5 personality, the big 5? Because this sort of is related, but I don't really. How do you test it? How do you know there are 5? What is it?
So there's it's research on these big 5 personality traits. There might be even more, 6 or 7, but the research now, the most of the research is focused on 5, and it started about 50 years ago or so. And the 5 personality traits are openness. First, let me tell you, they're sometimes called ocean traits, or big 5 because there are 5, and ocean because of the first letters. So O is openness, C is conscientiousness, extrovertedness, neuroticism, or you could call it also emotional instability, and agreeableness, AN. And so openness means you like new experiences. Conscientiousness means you are very dutiful and you like categorization and you are very on point and organized. Extrovertedness, of course, is you like to be the center of attention, or you like to be among people. Agreeableness is that you are mainly have empathetic concern for others. And neuroticism more emotional instability means that you are suffer from anxiety or depression or some other mental problem. Or the opposite, if you're very stable, you don't care so much and you're not affected by other people or misfortune and so on. And the research is done by asking people questions. We all have done this probably sometime in our lives, either if you want to go on a dating site, sometimes they ask you these questions, sometimes they do tests for fun in the social media. So you can ask people questions, and it's very surprisingly, they are very stable over your lifetime. They change a little, but quite stable. So if you do something with 20 and then with 30 or 35, they're similar if you answer them honestly. And you can also ask others. So I could ask your friends, is he very open, or is he very conscientious, or is he very often late to appointments and doesn't care so much about being precise and correct? And they will say almost the same as you. So first person evaluation and third person evaluations converge, are very similar. You can test them. You can test these characteristics by consumer choices. They're correlated with academic success. They're correlated with life expectancy, drug use. They're all characterizations. And about the variance we have among people is strong. So some people are very open, some are not very open. They're independent of one another. And the variance of these traits is explained only by half by the environmental factors. So there's a huge study by Tinka Polderman. It's called the mother of all studies. She did a meta-analysis of about 5,000 twin studies about heritability of certain traits. And you can say that the differences, the variance among the different people is determined only roughly half of it is determined by the environment. So you can say to a certain amount, it's really hard to put a number on it, but to a certain amount it must be heritable, innate. So you get it from your parents. If your parents are very open, it's likely that you are above average open. And some of these traits are also related to moral or political stances. That's what makes them also interesting, not only to preferences for art or academics or success in your profession, but also with preferences with politics. And one factor which has a strong connection to politics is openness. People who are very open, they like the new stuff, they like new ideas, new people, new foods, they like to travel in arts. And as you can hear, they're more on the progressive liberal, left liberal spectrum if you look at the political affiliation. And the second trait is conscientiousness. People who are very conscientious are structures, they like categorization, they adhere more to the status quo, they value duty, and they plan ahead. They have always, for everything, they have always a plan for everything what they do. They're not very spontaneous. And this is more correlated, not as strongly as openness, but more correlated with conservatism or traditionalism. And interestingly, since they're independent of one another,
I was wondering about this.
You
Are they
can
really
be very
independent?
conscientious and very open at the same time. And I think the studies pretty much show that if you want to be successful, you need both. So people who are very successful are very open. You need new ideas. For example, in science, you need curiosity, and you have to be open to new ideas, and you want to find out something new. So you're interested in what is new, but also you have to be quite dutiful and structured and ambitious to be successful in all areas of expertise: sports, arts, science, business. Whatever you do, you have to be very structured, dutiful, ambitious. And this is more conscientiousness. So you could have both, but if one is very high, openness is very high, conscientiousness is very low, then it's very likely that you're more like left wing or left liberal. And if it's the other way around, you're not very open, so you're very narrow-minded. You're not interested in what is new, but you're very structured and orderly. This is sort of the typical conservative traditional voter.
So does that mean that if you have a mix of the two, then there's not really very good political representation for you? So scientists, for example,
interesting.
Do they make terrible leaders? Or
No, I don't think. I mean, these are only tendencies, and of course, you cannot really deduce anything from the average group differences towards the individual. You can have a very open conservative and a very narrow-minded liberal, but on average, you would find them on the one or the other side. But I think many people are in non-polarized countries like Germany. Many people are anyway. They are in the political middle area. So in Germany, I think about 60% say I'm in the middle from the political point of view. They're not on the extremes, and I think this is sort of a commonplace if you don't have a two-party system. But in the US, when you compare it, where you have a two-party system, it's more likely that people are more polarized because you have to decide I'm this group or that group. I cannot have a third. If I don't like this group, I have to choose the other, or other way around. I cannot don't have a third option where I can refer to if I don't like both groups. And these systems tend to be a bit more polarized, and the middle is a bit more thinner, that people say, I have to decide. And I think conformism and tribalism adds to this movement away from the middle position towards more extreme or outside positions.
So the American system is in some sense set up to make people yell and scream at each other.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, it's... but when you look at the statistical data, there's one famous question from the Pew Research Center, Pew, and they ask about 10 policy questions to Americans, and they have done this now for 30 years or so. And the median of both groups on these policy questions, the Republicans and Democrats, were very close to one another. And many Democrats were right of the median of the Republicans, and many Republicans left of the median of the Democrats. So they had a huge overlap. But within the last 10 or 15 years, maybe it has to do with social media, it's not clear, but could be. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but could be a factor. Especially the median of the Democrats moved way to the left, so they became more progressive in a sense on these 10 questions. And the Republican median didn't move far, but what you can see is that on the very outside, the right-wing part of the Republican voters, there's a huge bulb now. So something like a backlash. You could really see, first you have a progressive movement. You could call it the progressive revolution. Everybody's becoming more progressive anyway, especially if you're on the left-hand side or the left liberal side of the political spectrum. And then maybe as a reaction, we don't know for sure, but it's very likely, at least one part of the Republicans became more extreme on these 10 issues. And this is a typical, it doesn't need to be like this. It was different 20 years ago, but apparently now the situation, or at least for the last 10 or 15 years or so, it's like this.
Maybe this will be a mechanism that will lead to generation of a new party or something. So
it could be. I mean, they're the independents, but they're not very influential at the moment. I guess they get 5% or so.
So is there really a moral difference? I know you're probably going to say yes to this, but is there really a moral difference between progressives and conservatives, or is it just different targets? So what I mean by that is, certain people might be disgusted or outraged if you were to burn the national flag, for instance, whereas other people might be outraged that you burn the rainbow flag.
Yeah.
So in other words, is there a genuine difference, or is it just different targets?
I think both is true. So the difference is in values, but the values have different objects, intentional objects. So if I say that loyalty towards my group, say towards my nation, and the flag is important, and you burn the flag, you violate this principle or this moral foundation, or you could say you do something harmful, not to me as an individual, but to my principles I value highly, namely loyalty to my country. And if you burn the rainbow flag for someone who's on the left liberal side, he or she might say, well, I have certain moral principles, diversity and inclusion of different sexual identities. That's very important to me. If you burn the flag, of course nobody is hurt by burning the flag, but you sort of attack these principles in there, maybe as holy to me as your nation is holy to you. So on this level, I think we have just a competition of values, and the values are sort of the weighing of the values is just differently.
It's kind of interesting that you said, well, that we've been talking about moral systems being built on a foundation of emotions, and then politics being built on a foundation of morals, because when people talk about anti-science, it's always the other side that's anti-science. I've got a list here because I'm going to forget them all, but if you think anti-nuclear, anti-GMO, anti-evolutionary psychology, flat earth, climate change denial, anti-evolution, anti-vax. So there's a whole list of them, and you can throw them in the different camps. Is it true that it's sort of, this is sort of bipartisan, really, isn't it? It's not
in the US. I think I used to think that the conservatives are more anti-science, and what happened to me is what's sometimes called a my side bias. So because I was reading only literature on cases where the conservatives have sort of moral investment, a certain identity they want to protect, and then they are against science. So for example, when it comes to climate change, it's a very obvious case. In all countries, the right-wing parties tend to deny or at least belittle man-made climate change. But then I read this fantastic book by Keith Stanovich. It's a colleague of Daniel Kahneman, sort of a very influential psychologist, and he wrote this book, The Bias That Divides Us. It's a recent book that came out, and he does exactly what you have done. He looks at all the different areas of science, and then he shows, look, there's evidence that when it comes to the conservative moral identity, of course, creationism and denial of climate change, this is sort of the typical anti-science sentiment you find on the right-wing side or the conservative side. But then when you look at research on heritability of intelligence, differences between men and women in all areas in biology, economic questions on the housing market, you find the same pattern only on the left-hand side, because on the left hand, if you say something like men and women differ in certain respects, and even from their biological makeup they differ, and we can show this with, even if this is published in Science and Nature, which it is, it sounds to some of them as if you want to justify differences in society between men and female. It sounds a bit as if you want to use science to justify inequality. And instead of attacking this false inference from science to norms, the naturalistic fallacy, people try to attack the factual statements, which of course it's a bad maneuver. It's sort of the reverse naturalistic fallacy, because it supposes that this, what's found out with empirical methods, has any saying on how we should live together, which it doesn't. But this is the reason why it sounds very often, if you say something like, to a certain extent, intelligence is heritable. This sounds as if you want to justify inequality in society, that some people are more successful than others, and so on. So you find exactly this, and then you have GMOs is a good example, because this idea of naturalness and holiness, we know from religions that they have this idea that certain forms of sexuality or certain forms of behavior are deemed natural and holy. But this a similar pattern you can find in the more esoteric left movement, that, for example, what is changed or unnatural in the biological realm cannot be good. So that's the idea. If you change the genetic code of corn or wheat, you might do some harm, because the natural makeup is how it's supposed to be. So this is sometimes called Gaia thoughts. So the idea that there's nature as a mother earth, like a Gaia, like the goddess of nurturing, and the goddess of the earth, the personified earth, and she knows best. So the nature has all the solutions for our ailments and illnesses, and we shouldn't interfere with it. But medicine, development of vaccination and so on, of course, was always intervention into nature, but this is sort of this similar unscientific view of the world, comparable to people denying climate change, because it sort of doesn't fit the ideology or the picture we have of how the world should be or is supposed to be.
This is sort of what I meant by the different targets. You have your different purity rituals. And
absolutely.
But I want to get onto, you made me think, I want to get onto sanitation and antibiotics and liberalization. But before that, there's another way that morality sort of blinds us, right? Because if to give an example, when you are listening to people who don't like immigrants, for example, they don't like refugees coming in, that sort of thing. They don't like migration. Then the rage is usually focused on the immigrants, and individually they're all very different people because they're individuals. Whereas the rage is never pointed. I'm not placing any value judgments on immigration, or I'm just saying the rage is never placed on, for example, the economic system which might give rise to migration. It's sort of really directed on individuals. Is there sort of a clear way of understanding why that is?
I mean, there are different mechanisms, I think, at work. So one mechanism is that people who look differently and behave differently instill fear and sometimes even disgust they can instill fear and disgust in us, and it is stronger with people who are already not very open towards new experiences, because then new people, they have different languages, different looks, different manners, different styles of communication. This is sort of, for someone who's not very open, is sort of a challenge, and someone who's very cosmopolitan and open might not be such a challenge. But I think there are many layers towards this problem. One is, very often it's more like a proxy sentiment. So it's not really that a person says, I'm against immigrants because they don't have my religion, or they have a dark skin, like pure first order racism. But it's very often like a proxy for something else. So, for example, they fear that the immigrants are dangerous or have morals very much diverging from our morals. And this is not such an irrational fear, because typically immigrants come from countries who are not as liberal and democratic as the countries they move to, because the more liberal democratic countries are more the richer countries. So and then very often we tend to, and I used to do the same, we tend to judge someone only by his sentiments, that he says, I'm not so open when it comes to migration, without asking what the reasons are. Are the reasons that he doesn't like foreigners? So this is sort of taste-based discrimination, which we all sort of reject. Or is it something more complicated, something like maybe the social system is not made for so many immigrants, or maybe he or she fears that the norms will be different. And I think you can observe this when it comes to not hate, but sort of rejection of Muslim immigrants. Because in Germany, for example, people don't worry too much about immigrants from Denmark, but even from Japan. So it doesn't have to be, it could be the skin color, because Danish look similar to sort of native Germans. But when people come from East Asia, Korea or Japan, people are not so skeptical. It's only that they become skeptical, or it's more likely that they become skeptical when people come from countries where they think, even falsely, could be true or false, that these countries have more strict conservative rules, or that they're not as gender equal as we want to have, or that they are against minorities, or are don't allow for religious freedom and so on. So I think it's hard to put them apart, and we tend to judge people too often just by, say, one statement or one act, without asking for the intentions or preferences behind it, because it's really hard to find the real preferences. And it's sort of a tendency we all have. Oh, someone says he's skeptical of immigration, he must be right. Right in the sense of right wing, not right. But maybe he's not right wing, but has other concerns. And especially interesting is that, for example, in the US, Latin Americans are more skeptical of immigration than liberal whites. And you could say, many immigrants come from Middle and South America to the US, and why are you more skeptical than the whites? But it could also be that in your everyday life, if you're a affluent liberal white at the coast, you will never really interact and see a rivalry between you and the immigrants. But if you live in a village where then these people have to live until they can find a job, or if you're in the job market, in a section where you have a strong rivalry, and new people come who are maybe more skilled than you are, or who can offer their labor at a lower price, and then a rivalry situation comes up, and then you're more inclined to say, I don't want that. It's easier to judge, to be cosmopolitan, if you don't have to do anything to do with those people who you very open. If you talk about virtue signaling, you can be very open, but you don't have any skin in the game. You don't have to invest anything from your life into your political opinion. You can just have it, you can broadcast it, you can elevate your cosmopolitan status, but you don't have to deal then with the everyday life situations as others have to do.
So really you benefit, you don't see any downside, so it really makes sense because you're signaling to a different group.
Yeah, and it's always, I think very often moral has also to do with status. I call it the status game, it's like a moral game. You want to broadcast your moral status to others, but you don't want to invest too much energy in broadcasting. So the ideal form is that everybody thinks you're a good moral person without you doing anything. And the opposite case is someone working every day, helping in a soup kitchen for immigrants, but it's not broadcasting it at all. So that's the opposite case. So investing a lot of energy and time, maybe money or whatever, investing something, especially time and effort, but not broadcasting it. And we tend to want to have a lot of broadcast and not so much effort. And then it's easier to be. There's one good example in Germany. There was a recent study about the wolf. So in some areas, the wolf is now returning. But all these areas, the more wolf sightings you have in an area, the more likely is this area to vote for right-wing populists. There's a correlation. It's maybe not causation, but there's at least a correlation. And then people say, yeah, it's funny. It's sort of, they fear the immigrants and they fear something that's sort of foreign and now comes back, and they sort of it's a ridiculous fear. And in a sense, of course, it might be exaggerated, but also in another sense, it's decided somewhere in Berlin, let the wolf come back into these areas. People who decide this don't live in these areas. They're not afraid to walk with their kids through the forest and maybe a wolf attack, even if it's super rare. They don't have sheeps which are killed by the wolf. So all the negative side effects of this decision, they don't have to deal with. So it's easy to be, it's so nice to have a wolf, the animal comes back, and so nature and it's in order again, is so great. But you don't see that people who are against this might be offended by this, that now they have to deal with the wolf they don't want, and it was decided somewhere else. And then the wolf becomes a proxy for the not hate, but the sort of rejection of the system. So the people reject the system, and you could do the same with the wind wheels. How do you call them?
Turbines.
Yeah, the turbines. So the turbines are typically in rural areas. They put the turbines everywhere there. The people don't like it. It doesn't look good, but the energy goes to the city. So it's city people deciding that turbines are in front of in the beautiful landscape of people living there. So it's city against countryside, and many cases are like this, that sort of they might be a proxy, partly, maybe not, that's not the whole explanation, but partly they might be a proxy for something else.
It makes me wonder, this is actually quite nice, because it allows me to jump into a topic from a direction that I didn't want to come in, well, I didn't expect to come in from. So how important is lived experience? In the sense that, people will often say, for example, you're not allowed to talk about this topic because you don't belong to group A. Yeah. So here we have an example where we have some people of privilege who are, for instance, they can signal to their in-group saying that, I don't have any problem with this particular group of immigrants coming in. They can make themselves look good, but as you said, they don't have to compete. It's all positives for them. And similarly with the wolf situation, it sort of has a flavor very similar to, but the opposite of, when people are saying, you can't talk about this topic because you haven't experienced this. What's your thought on the importance of lived experience when it comes to arguing? Should we really, do humans empathize or
I'm not so sure. I think as far as I know from what I've read about this, I think it's based on a conceptual mistake, I think. So the idea from the lived experience is that some experiences, for example, marginalization or discrimination, can only be experienced by individuals, and these individuals have a certain first-person authority about their experiences, and of course, I cannot have someone else's experience. And the idea is when we talk about topics like discrimination, for me, for example, I can't even remember that I was ever discriminated against. So since I have no first-hand experience, I cannot really talk about this topic. And I think the concept, so first I think there's a conceptual mistake, because normally when we talk about moral evaluations, we say something like discrimination is bad. But why is it bad? Not because we make this judgment not because we can we have experienced it before, then we could never make a judgment about murder, because you cannot demand that somebody gets murdered in order to judge about that's bad to get murdered. And what conceptually is, I think, confusing is that the how does it feel to be robbed, discriminated, or whatever, is confused with that. So I think it's bad that discrimination occurs, even if we cannot feel how it is. So I can say it's bad that someone is losing a leg, even if I never have experienced how it feels like to lose a leg. I think this is sort of, and what we normally judge in moral statements is that aspect, because then we can talk objectively about this and about the harm. Of course, it can be that, for example, an insult is more harmful than I thought. So I could be saying something like, well, an insult is not as bad as getting physically attacked, but then I could do a study of all the people insulted, since I was never really insulted, and they say, no, actually, if I have the choice, I prefer getting beaten up than getting insulted. So the value is different. But then what I do is I generalize, I don't look at one single experience, but I generalize empirically over many experiences, and then they have to be comparable. So, and then I do exactly the same. I put it on an objective view, an interpersonally objective view, because I ask the people how bad it is. So I think this also is a counter argument against the view that you cannot talk about the topic if you have not experienced it, because if one person experiences the same insult, say, at the strength of 6 out of 10, and the next 5 and 7, you have to average it in any case. And maybe the one person you were talking about is very sensitive when it comes to insults compared to the average, and maybe some other person is more robust. But you cannot really argue that on the one hand side, this person has authority, but then also say it generalizes over all the other experiences. But because if every single person has authority over his or her experiences, you cannot generalize. You can only generalize if you say, okay, we build the average, and then maybe you're above or below average, but then you have already assumed that you can compare experiences. So I think that this sort of is a bit philosophical, but I think these two are the wrong turns in the argumentative debate. But can I add a little thing? Yeah. And I think, why is it still so common now to hear this? And I think we have many terms in the moral discourse that also can be used for the status game. So I think we have status for our looks, our merits, or the money we have, or the academic achievements. So we can measure everything on a scale. So I know someone is younger than me, or more successful, or I'm better in sports. So on all the scales, I can immediately I sort of find my position, and I have a keen view on what the others are and where I stand. I might be mistaken about, I might exaggerate my own achievements, but I do this all the time. I think we do the same with morals. So we look at other people and we think, is this a generous person? Is this sort of someone to be trusted? Is that someone who's sensitive when it comes to discrimination? Is he or she more harsh when it comes to immigration? So we have this sort of, we play this moral game. And I think certain terms are, this is tempting to use them in this game to be on the moral higher status than others. So, for example, if I suffer something like discrimination, I want some respect and some compensation for it. But when someone in the society says, "Look, in this group, if you suffer discrimination, you get sort of a reward, you get a higher status," then I will tend to exaggerate a bit. It's really hard not to exaggerate, and once I do this, it's really obvious that, so for example, when someone questions my authority and says, look, someone said a slur to you, it's bad, but come on, it happens. Go to the police or just let it go, and it won't affect your life. This is sort of the standard view we had a couple of years ago. This is sometimes called the dignity culture. So if someone insults you, even if it's bad, either you go to the police if it's really bad, or you deal with it and say something back, or just ignore the person. This is because in everyday life you will encounter, sooner or later, you slights and you will encounter challenges from other people. It's normal. But then when you change to this victimhood culture that you morally value being a victim or fighting against victimhood, then you're more inclined to say, well, you don't challenge my perspective because I have authority about my perspective. I have the lived experience. And then you give people, it's really hard for them to falsify their own statements. So it's sort of an immunization strategy, because if someone would say, well, you're exaggerating. I always could say, no, well, it's my lived experience. You cannot talk, you don't have any authority to talk to me about this because it's mine. And I think with many terms we have now, they always come from the idea of protecting minorities and being more sensitive, but they're very often used also in a sort of a dominant way. So,
and sometimes by outgroups.
Yeah, by outgroups. So for example, mansplaining, they're really these type of men who have a derogative way of explaining things to you, especially if they're male, and then to younger females say, I explain it to you. Well, you don't know, like this. But very often in a discussion, if you have a male and a female, maybe the male is explaining something and then the female is explaining something. So it's not mansplaining if just a male person explains something. It has to be derogative in order to count as real mansplaining. But in the status game, you might exaggerate it, and every time someone explains it to you, as a female, you don't like it that this person has a different view. So you are maybe prone to call it mansplaining, even if it's sort of not really.
It's like a power grab.
It's not a power. I don't think that's very often intentionally, but it's more like it's a natural inclination to use whatever means we can have in a discussion, even unconsciously or half knowingly. And the phenomenon behind it is sometimes called concept creep. So all the concepts we have for harm, like trauma, violence, addiction, depression, are now used in a much wider sense than they were used 20 or 30 years ago. You can really show this. There's a researcher, Nick Haslam is his name, is a really great paper, who sort of went through all these terms and looked in the dictionaries how they changed over time. And the prevalence of these terms are also higher. There's another study that shows in the last 10 years all these harm-related concepts, suppression, trauma, misogyny, racism, sexism, they all went up in frequency in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in 40 outlets of the media, and also in abstracts of academic papers. There's a study about 140 million abstracts, 147 million abstracts. And you could show that these terms appear 10 years or so, they started spiking in all abstracts. Yeah. So the prevalence is higher of these terms. So we are more alerted to harm. We use it in a more wider sense. We say now words are violence, emotional aggression. We used to say aggression is physical attack 20 years ago. Depression used to be really like clinical depression. You had to be in bed for 4 weeks and couldn't move and were really, really sort of medically sick. And now people say I'm depressed or I have a depression, even if this doesn't count in the earlier sense as depression when they are for 1 week in bed. Or trauma used to be if you have shell shock as a soldier or have lived through something horrible like rape or like a very severe accident, and now people say they're traumatized if they're misgendered or if they see a soldier in the train in uniform. Sometimes people say it traumatizes me, so they use it in a much wider sense. You can do this, but then of course you will find more cases and you're more sensitive to little little insults and little norm violations, which are there, but which used to be something like everyday life, benign.
I wonder
encounters.
if this sort of language creep actually has a back reaction in the sense that you do actually feel worse as well. So
Certainly.
To give like an example that's sort of orthogonal, I guess now we're more aware of soldiers who come back from war with PTSD. And so the question you could ask is, do soldiers now suffer more because we have this terminology, or are we becoming more aware of some suffering that was always underlying?
Yeah, of course, people who are more prone to adhere to the victimhood culture would say the second. These were always norm violations or always real problems, but we didn't have the vocabulary for it, and now we have it, and then we can pinpoint it. And this is certainly true. There's studies showing that if I don't have a term like racial profiling, even for people who are profiled racially, say it's like an African American is profiled, or someone here in Germany with a darker skin is profiled by the police more often than his peers, would maybe not summarize this as a violation because he or she doesn't have the term for it. But once you have the term racial profiling, you're more alerted to maybe this practice is morally wrong. It's a sort of a indirect form of discrimination, and it's but was harder to pinpoint. So there's something like it's sometimes called epistemic injustice in philosophy. I think Miranda Fricker is the author of the book. So the idea is that there's different types of this epistemic injustice, and one type is hermeneutic injustice. If you don't have the terms for something, you cannot really articulate it, and you might not see it. But I think you can also make the case for the other mechanism, that once you alert people to certain problems, they will find more of the problems. And there's one experiment quite recently, Levari and colleagues, I think it was Nature or Science, and they did this experiment on prevalence-induced concept creep. And they had one experiment showing people ambiguous faces, and some were clearly aggressive and some were clearly friendly, and there were sort of morphed faces in the middle who were not really. And people were very solid, and they were very good in singling out the aggressive faces. But then they started presenting them less and less aggressive faces. And then their threshold wandered towards the more open and nice faces. And they identified ambiguous faces as aggressive, which they hadn't identified before. And you can do this with colors, you can do this with texts, and it seems to be a real deep ingrained aspect of the human cognition, because if you find it in different modalities, it's very likely that's sort of a basic mechanism. It's not only perception, but it's sort of faces, colors, language, and terms, as Haslam studied. So there's some evidence that probably this is working too. And once we start looking for slight, tiny norm violations and classify them as sexism or racism, even if they are even if there's no real harm done, or even if the harm is so tiny that it doesn't doesn't have an impact on your life, for example, then we tend to see more. And that's one explanation, I think, why people, when you ask them, always think there's more sexism and racism in the Western world, although old studies in almost all countries show that the first order attitudes decreased. So people are more liberal, less homophobic, less sexist, less racist than they used to be. But since we are so
finely tuned
to the remaining part, of course there's still racism and sexism in the world, there's enough to find, we get the wrong impression as if it's going up, although our instruments are fine. It's a bit like finding mercury in water. If you have better instruments, no matter how refined the water is, you will find traces of mercury or lead or whatever. The finer the instruments, the more likely it is you find something, but it's below the threshold of any harmful dose, but you can still sort of show it.
Yeah, I've always sort of wondered whether through care and compassion and through really paying attention to this sort of terminology, you can actually in the end generate suffering in some way, which would be rather unfortunate. But on the topic of lived experience, since that's where we started, it's always sort of, although I empathize with the idea, it's always sort of felt a bit wrong to me because, well, first of all, it doesn't seem very scientific that only certain people can measure certain things. But you know, if you go back in time, there was a time when people would say, oh, you could never have a female prime minister or president because the commander-in-chief has to be someone who can empathize with going to war. You know, if you're not someone in the population who maybe has been to war or sort of has the chance of going, then you shouldn't in the end run the country. And then at the same time, fast forward to today, and you have people saying, you know, men, for instance, shouldn't have a say when it comes to abortion, or never mind that there's many women who will, maybe infertile women, for example, and so it would seem inconsistent to me to be able to say one and not the other, and so it sort of it's always stood out to me as a poor argument, even though I cannot empathize with it. I wanted to get on to sanitation and vaccination and antibiotics, and ask you what these things have to do with liberalization.
So there's a study by Thornhill and Fincher, I guess, is are the two scientists, and they developed the parasite stress theory of democratization. And it was already known that in areas of the world where you have a lot of violence and a lot of danger from natural disasters and so on, people are a bit more traditional and conservative. And maybe it's a strategy, as I said before, to deal with problems. So if you stick together as a family or as a group, you're better protected among one another. For example, if misfortune happens. And they did a large survey on parasites in the world regions. In some regions you have many parasites, in the warmer regions more than in the colder regions. And they found out that in those world regions where you have a lot of parasite stress, so it's easy to get worms and other parasites by eating or by sexual intercourse or by just normal intercourse, because close contact with the hands and so on, it's easier to get infected. People tend to be more conservative and traditionalist, and you could show this for almost all countries. There's a very strong correlation. So the safer the medical biological environment is, the more open can people be. For example, if I don't fear that my libertine lifestyle, where I have a lot of this is sort of an example. So say I have a lot of sexual intercourse and I have very sort of the Berlin lifestyle, but if I have a lot of, I can protect myself from infection, and I'm not thinking that people are very unclean or infectious, then I can have this lifestyle. But in a country where I know it's very likely that I will get infected if I have intercourse with many people, I will be, of course, a bit more conservative when it comes to sexuality. It will take longer. I want to know the people. Sort of a hookup sex party culture is not something you would expect in those regions. And they made a very strong case that even the liberalization in the West, an important part for them was the anti-baby pill and more an improvement in hygiene on average that made certain sexual norms more liberal and gave way for a more open lifestyle. And so this is sort of the idea, but it's really, of course, it's always hard to say about causation and correlation. But there were some studies that at least show something that's sometimes called the authoritarian reflex. So if you have a situation where this environment changes from safe to unsafe, people then in the world value surveys, the years later, tend to give a bit more conservative answers, which still can be just a correlation, but it indicates a certain causal link between change of environment and then change of norms. There's one study, for example, that the swine flu, or was it Ebola? There was one study on the swine flu and one on Ebola in the US, and the voters were a bit more conservative when both pandemics came out, and those who were vaccinated against the swine flu were not affected by stories about how dangerous the swine flu is. They, for example, didn't change their views on immigration, but people who were not vaccinated changed their views on immigration and were a bit more strict on immigration. And of course, the flu, same with Corona. When you had the lockdown everywhere in the world, some people were sort of more afraid of foreigners, especially when they looked Asian, because they thought, okay, it's the Asian disease, and if you look Asian, you probably have it. And then they expressed more fear of foreigners than others.
That actually, it makes me curious, because in America, it seemed to be that people on the right were predominantly the people who didn't really seem to care much about Corona, right? They thought it was ridiculous, all these lockdown laws. And so why would it be, so if disgust sensitivity correlates with conservatism, why would it be the right side of politics that is sort of,
disgust sensitivity first says everybody is moving a bit to the conservative side. So you would see it more with people who are very liberal becoming a bit more conservative. And the other effect is, of course, you have rivaling moral principles. So I think what happened was, in the beginning, in Germany, for example, you could see that
there was a spread right here. We had the Querdenker, and that was
but before the Querdenker came, there was a very short period where at least the right-wing populist AfD accused the government of not being strict enough. And then after a while, they realized that people find it more pressing that the government sort of oppresses them and changes their lives. So it was more about freedom, or at least what they understood as negative freedom. The government tells me what to do. And this produced stronger reactions. And then the AfD at least capitalized on this reaction and were against most of the measurements. And I think the same happened with the Republicans. It was more about the sentiment, the government is telling me what to do, and I don't want the government to tell me what to do. So it was not so much about infection, but was more about who is in charge, and I don't want others to tell me what to do. And this is a very strong, so it's sort of, there's two ways of thinking about freedom, negative and positive freedom. So Leibniz and Isaiah Berlin have sort of written on this. So freedom, negatively understood, is being free of coercion or oppression. It's sort of the negative, the absence. I want to have the absence of coercion. Freedom is the absence of something. You're free if you're not in chains, as Hume would put it. And then the positive view on freedom is you're free if you're free to follow your self-expression or your preferences. So if you can do one thing or the other, you can express yourself. Sort of, this is the autonomy view on freedom, and this is sort of more the positive view. I can do this or can do this. Give me the chance to flourish and express myself through my actions. And in the liberal and like in the say in the conservative area, but also like libertarians in the US and Liberale in German are more they lean more towards negative freedom. They want the government to leave them alone. They would just want to do their thing, and the government should not interfere economically or personally with my affairs. But when you look at the left, the progressive side, they have a more positive view on freedom, like a view on positive freedom. So the government's duty is to give everybody the same chance of fulfilling their dreams and living by their, according to their preferences or desires. And this was more the idea, okay, but then you have some need more protection. So in order to give them their freedom of living, we have to restrict the others in their use. So we have to tell them to wear masks and to stay at home and to get vaccinated. And this is also a female clash. So many studies in the US and Germany showed that males don't like so much if people tell them what to do, much less because they're less concerned with safety of others and more concerned with impediments to their own freedom. Whereas on the female side, people are the women are a bit more concerned with the vulnerable, the children, and those who cannot protect themselves. So they were more on the side, well, the government can be strong as long as it protects those in danger.
It's sort of interesting, right? Because people say that women are more disgust sensitive.
Yeah.
At least that's what I understand.
No, but this is what the studies show. Yeah, it's true.
And so that would sort of make me think that women should be more conservative.
Yeah. If it's only disgust, it should be.
That's thought overridden, right?
Yeah, it must be overridden. I don't know the answer to this question because, but I ask myself exactly the same. If you read the literature, it's pretty clear. It's a worldwide fact that women are more disgust sensitive than men. The typical evolutionary explanation is it has to do with food and caring for children. Maybe it's a very old mechanism that you have to be very aware of what is infectious and rotten and good or not good for you and the child. So maybe this is could be the mechanism. But then, of course, disgust sensitivity is correlated with conservatism and it's a strong indicator. There are some studies now who say maybe it depends again on the questions. So interpersonal disgust seems to be a more conservative thing, but food disgust, maybe it's a more liberal thing. So exactly what you said before, it strongly depends on the target or the focus of your research. If you only ask people about interpersonal disgust, do you find these foreigners disgusting? Of course, then you find more on the conservative side, but if you look more like food disgust, maybe you find other. So this is still an open question. There's sort of still a debate in psychology about what kind of disgust we are talking about. And if you change the questions, you get different answers. But I think also, it must be overridden. It's probably that then agreeableness could be stronger, or the caring for the weak could be stronger and override this.
There could be also a first mover effect, right, with regards to why Republicans in America and why the AfD here in Germany were sort of anti-vaccine. So in the States, for example, Trump sort of came out at the very beginning saying it didn't really matter, it was going to be gone. I wanted to ask you earlier, because from reading your book, you have this sentence about Al Gore and how he... so I wanted to ask... Al Gore came out being concerned about climate change, and I suppose he was on the left, right? And so now climate change is sort of the people who have more strongly in climate denial, change denial, are sort of on the right side of the spectrum. And do you think it could have been different? Do you think it could have been the case that if Al Gore had not been the one that came out, that things would have been different? Is there sort of this idea of a moral first mover?
Yeah, it's a bit of this. This is not in the book, but there's some evidence for this view. I mean, I've written a bit about it, but there's new evidence about this view. So one observation is that the Republicans, George Bush, the father of George W. Bush, in the 80s, late 80s, I think, he brought forth one of the most comprehensive nature protection programs in the history of the US. And it was very common that there was among the voters of the Republicans a stronger connection towards nature. You live more in rural areas, hunting and going out was a bit like into nature was a bit more common. And there was a religious connection that nature is sort of made by God. It's God's creation. So there was a strong connection that you have to protect nature. But it seems that it got a new framing when Al Gore said climate change is sort of the topic of the Democrats, and then it seems a bit like a backlash. The reaction from the Republicans was, we are against Al Gore and the Democrats. He is proposing that climate change is a real problem, so now we are against climate change. Although the tradition was more like the nature protective tradition was more associated with Republicans. And then I think it's more like first mover is one aspect, but also tribalism, that it's not so much about, is it true that climate change exists, but is it the topic of my opponent or is it my topic, which is in a sense really naive, because some topics they don't have a political aspect. I mean, either the climate changes or doesn't. It doesn't care about your political position. But then there's new evidence came out about 2 or 3 years ago. There was a paper about the Fox News effect, which really sort of supports this view that has to do with the backlash. Because when the Green New Deal was first announced, I think 3 or 4 years ago, and you ask Republicans and Democrats what do you think of the Green New Deal? So the idea that you invest in green technology, but also in a sense that you don't produce a lot of adverse effects, but that you do it in a way that you support the working class. So like a socially sensitive way of changing from the old industry to the green industry. And the majority of Republicans thought it's a good idea. I think 50 or 60%, maybe even more. And then Fox News framed the whole debate as a sort of a new idea from the left. The Green New Deal is a new idea from the left. And then you could see in the surveys that I think it was half a year or a year, a very short period of time, I don't know the numbers, but not longer than 1 or 2 years. In a very short period of time, the approval shrank.
Disappeared or reduced.
Yeah, reduced to
shrank.
To a very small percentage, only by reframing the debate. So it must have been that the people were in this situation that they thought, my party is sort of against it, the majority seems to be against it, Fox News is representative of this majority, and I used to like it, but now I don't like it anymore. But sort of this is how opinion change can happen, even though apparently before that there was a majority in the country to have a Green New Deal.
It's interesting. I want to get on to your topic of bullshit.
Yeah. Let's talk about this.
So it sort of does lead in, right? Because what is it that makes what is it that makes bullshit so captivating?
Yeah.
So why is it that we get drawn into fake news? What is it about our evolved psychology that makes us sort of susceptible to misinformation, disinformation, lies, and bullshit?
I say something about what bullshit is before, and then about the second question. So we all know who a liar is. So a liar is someone who knows the truth and says something he or she believes to be untrue in order to deceive someone. So that's a typical case of lying. And we know someone who is honest. It's just the opposite. And then there was this philosopher, Harry Frankfurt, who said, well, there's something in the middle between the two. There's a person who is not lying, but doesn't care really about whether what he or she is saying is true or false. And maybe we think of Trump as a prime example, because Trump at some occasion said, I just said it and I didn't even know whether it's true or false. I don't care. And this attitude, not caring whether it's true or false, Harry Frankfurt called this person is a bullshitter. He said he's in between the honest person and the liar is the bullshitter. The bullshitter is sort of indifferent towards the truth. He doesn't care about it. And in a sense, he's maybe even more dangerous, because the liar at least knows, or supposedly knows, what is true or false. And he's just a deceptive person, whereas the bullshitter has given up on truth. He doesn't care at all anymore. And it was a bit like it came out in the 80s, and now it's sort of an interesting, it almost looks like a cultural diagnosis made 20 years earlier in advance of our time, because now with social media we have the ability to promote almost everything, and very often we don't know whether it's true or false. We just like it, we click it, we share it, and it's much easier now to disseminate what Harry Frankfurt is calling bullshit. But you can expand the term a bit. I think you should bullshit in the more ordinary sense of the word comprises fake news, conspiracy theories, pseudoscience, quackery, humbug. I mean, there are all kinds of sort of ways of speaking where people really don't know or don't care about whether it's true or false. And then you can ask yourself, why is there so much bullshit in the world? And I think especially when you look at digital media, it's there's a sort of a competition. The different statements are in a competition of over our attention. So it's a bit like a survival of the fittest. And when something is new, exciting, emotionally laden, politically extreme or interesting, it grabs our attention. And if it's complex and more of average nature, it doesn't grab our attention. So, and a true statement sometimes is very exciting, but very often not so exciting. And if I don't care about the truth, I don't care. I can make up only statements that are emotionally charged, exciting, and will lead to a lot of attention. So if you have a fight for attention between a true statement and a bullshit statement, the bullshit statement will always win, because everything the true statement can do, the bullshit statement can do too, without need for being precise, accurate, and so on. And I think this is one reason why fake news are potentially are easily disseminated than real news. I mean, there are a few studies that show it's easier. People remember fake news more often, they share it easier, and so on, because they have something in their content that makes it more interesting. And I think that can be many reasons. I mean, but in some sense, they sort of appeal to us emotionally. Either they disgust us or anger us, or we find it interesting, or it sort of supports our view. So no matter what it is, it's always easier to have these features than doing the same but being honest to the truth, which is harder, of course.
Can you do politicians get away, I mean, you mentioned Trump.
Yeah.
Do politicians get away with bullshit because in some sense it's expected? Is the thing that we dislike deception rather than lies?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, Trump is a new case. I mean, there was nothing like this before. There were always these archives of the lies of the presidents from the New York Times. And if you look at Hillary Clinton as a candidate, for example, or Bill Clinton or Obama, they had their fair share of lies too. I mean, all politicians lie once in a while, maybe intentionally, or sometimes they might say something which is wrong and they don't know, and we think it's a lie, but they are lying and bullshitting. I mean, that's sort of common. But there's a certain level we don't want to cross. I mean, we accept that even our most cherished politicians sometimes lie, but if they do it on a regular basis, like 10 lies a day is too much. And it's getting out of hand. And I think with Trump was a different situation because he also was valued for his authenticity. And for a strange reason, just saying what he wanted to say and not caring about the truth was a bit also a signal, the signal of power. I have the power not to care at all, not even whether it's true or false what I say, I just say it. And for some reason it was appealing to at least a part of the Republican voters who thought this is sort of the way you have to fight against the establishment, although he himself was establishment and upper class and connected and so on. But he could sort of promote himself as authentic by not following the norms, not even the norms of rational discourse of saying what is true or false. I think that is what happened. But it didn't really work so well, for example, with the AfD in Germany, if you compare this. Maybe because they don't really have a charismatic leader as Trump, or for some other reasons, but they tended to say that everything in the press is lies. We have this famous word Lügenpresse, so the press is full of lies, a bit what Trump also says when he said fake news in the sense of the news agency or the news outlet like the New York Times or CNN is fake as a whole, not a single news information, but the sort of the news station is fake. But we didn't have this so much, and people were very concerned because of Trump in Germany when it came to fake news. It was one of the most important topics in 2017, 2018, and they really wanted the government or whatever institution to do something against it. So in a sense, I think they became very sensitive towards this problem. And my impression is, at least from the numbers, the majority thinks it's a problem and wants to have an honest discourse based on facts.
I wonder, apart from signaling to your constituents or whoever you're trying to get the message out to, what other benefits there were in the background for politicians like Trump. So, for example, one of the problems today is that everyone has so much information. You can get so much more information about the politicians and their lives, everything. You can see everything, and everyone's sort of on 24/7. So one of the things I wonder about is when you start throwing bullshit into the airwaves, you sort of reduce the available bandwidth that people have. They've got to sort of fight against these different things. And so I sort of, the specific question I have is, what's going on in the background as people are throwing out bullshit in the foreground, but just more generally, who benefits from bullshit? This is I think a different. I don't have a definite answer, but I think it's a very pressing question. So the first observation is there was one study about the production of fake news during the campaign Hillary Clinton against Trump, and they found out that there are, if you look at all the fake news, that about less than 2% of people were producing 80% of the fake news content. They're called super spreaders. And funnily, on the other side, intentionally,
yeah, people do nothing else from early morning till nightfall than producing and sharing fake news information. So it's a very small fraction, 80%.
Sorry to interrupt you. Is this? Do you mean like paid actors or just as people?
This is hard to say because the study doesn't. It could be trolls, could be bots, could be paid content. Even foreign agencies interfering, you don't really know. But this is sort of what you could get from the network data. And the other group is the super consumers. So again, around 2% or even less of the consumers consumed 80% of all fake news. So you have two little groups sitting in echo chambers. One is producing all the time, and one is consuming all the time. And when you look from the outside on Twitter, you think every second posting is fake news. Nobody cares for truth anymore, but the majority cares for truth. Is just sort of it's a bit like it's a bit like thermodynamics, you know. Half jokingly, I called it the how's it called? Unordnung in German. It's
unordered.
Yeah, if you produce, it's easier to produce unorder than order. Disorder. Disorder, yeah. So, and the same is with information. I mean, it takes more energy to clean up. Yeah. If someone pollutes, your information space, as you described, with fake news, it's the energy to say, okay, look, you have read this, it's fake news. It takes more energy for me. It's much easier to share, and to correct it, and to reach the same people, and then make them change their minds. It takes more energy. So there's always an asymmetry. If someone starts with fake news, counter actions need more and more and more energy. So so something like an entropy of content. The entropy, how do you say in physics, rises.
The entropy increases.
Increases, yeah. The entropy of information bullshit increases because to get order again, you need more energy, in a sense. I think this is, and then people inferred from this that there could be an interest for someone like Trump to send out so many informations that people don't believe the facts anymore. And this is sort of really hard to tell. There's this concept gaslighting, so that you confuse someone by so many false events or claims.
They can't trust.
They don't trust their intuitions or their gut feeling or their judgment anymore. But there's no real empirical evidence, as far as I know, that really shows this, that people, after they are confronted with so many fake news, stop believing any news. So I think it's more likely that it's just a fight for attention. And as you said, if the attention span is limited and you sort of occupy the center of attention, even if it's fake news and bullshit, you take away the resources from the other person and the attention from the other person who has maybe more complicated but more honest content. I think this is what happened. And also people have motivated cognition, as we talked about earlier. So they tend to share and like fake news more if it confirms their own ideology. There was a huge study that showed that's almost same on the left and the right hand side, a bit more on the right hand side, but not dramatically more. So we all have the tendency, if it sort of fits our ideology, and then we share it more. So that makes it even easier for fake news content to get shared. And that's sort of the basic setting.
How divided are we really? It feels like there's division. It feels like people are really at each other's throats. But is it real or just perceived?
I think it's in many cases it's just perceived, because we take social media, and I think especially Twitter, because this is important for journalists, as a proxy for the public in general. And there's a typical bias called the availability bias, that we tend to judge from a problematic sample. So normally the sample has to be representative of the whole, and this is done in surveys if they're done well in social sciences. But if I look at Twitter, I get the impression this is one group and this is the other group, and these are representative, say, of Democrats or Republicans, or in Germany of the left and the right, or of certain parties. But we know just from a lot of research that people who are more extreme get more attention on social media. Content that has certain words and emotional phrases gets more traction by the algorithms. Certain people get more reactions from the other side, which gets them more attention again because of engaged content. So you have sort of a winner takes it all mechanism, that a few people get a lot of attention and then you have a long tail of all the others. And this gives everybody the impression the world is a place that is so polarized and so unforgiving that we will never come to any agreement. And then you have this new phenomenon of the exhausted majority. So many people say, I'm not at social media. Even if I look on TV and see the debates, they are far away from my position. They're too extreme. I don't want to engage in this style of public debate. And when you look at studies on the actual views on policies or on inequality, for example, in Germany, I know a lot of data on Germany, but also in the US, people are very often less polarized. So, for example, there was one study from Steffen Mau, who's a professor of sociology at the Humboldt University, and they ask people about inequalities, so about migration, economic inequality, and sexual identity or sexual diversity. And you could say roughly race, class, gender, the three large topics of social justice and inequality. And people gave very similar answers and had very similar views that these three areas are problematic and that people are suffering. And there was some difference, some polarization when it comes to migration, a bit stronger than when it came to sexual diversity and socioeconomic diversity. There were some differences, minor differences between people who were very poor, who were more concerned with socioeconomic differences, people who were very rich and affluent and educated were more concerned with migration and gender inequality. Of course, it's sort of a certain bias or interest you have there, but overall, you couldn't really find the classical picture of polarization where you have the two bumps of a camel, and the middle is sort of thin and there's nobody in the middle. But in general, it was more like a how do you call it, like an equal distribution, more or less. Of course, not super, not mathematic in the mathematical sense, but still, when you look at journalism, of course, they prioritize conflict. So they tend much more to focus on contentious issues and struggle and fights and polarization when it comes to the public debate, but it's not shared by most of the people. In the US, it might be different because there's a lot of evidence that shows that the people really are falling apart. But this is not true in other areas. I don't know about Australia, for example, or other countries. France is a bit more polarized than Germany. Only about 30%, 1/3 says I'm in the middle, in the political middle, and about 1/3 says I'm on either side. So this is a bit uncommon. But they also have a presidential system and not a many-party system, because in the end, only one party wins. So
I think I'm in a bit of a bubble here in Berlin, so I don't really have a good feel for what the country's like in general. I've been too far outside of Australia. But what memes would you say right now in the current discourse are bullshit?
Memes?
Yeah. Memes are like the social version of a gene, some
The
concepts that spread.
Dawkins. The first that comes to my mind is in Germany, we have now a debate about police brutality that sort of mirrors, in a sense, the American debate. But it's very rare that the police killed someone in Germany. I don't know how many there are, 2 digits or so. And sometimes people share, and on the left, of course, you have to show that you are against authority and any form of discrimination or aggression. And then they tend to share videos or snippets of police stopping, say, someone, or checking someone, or putting someone in handcuffs. And sometimes this is even rough, but it's very typical that you see little videos, and the same happens to me. My first reaction is, they are very brutal to this guy. Does he deserve it? Why is it like this? But very often it comes out, if you see the story before and after, or the wider context, and maybe the person has attacked someone before, or was dangerous, or was beside himself. So of course there are cases of real police brutality that have to be prosecuted, but very often is sort of the sentiment is the police is brutal and very racist. And if you look at the numbers in Berlin, for example, almost a third of police officers has a migration background in Berlin. And the police has about 250,000 members in Germany. And by the numbers, even if you have what of course is reprehensible, small networks of racist police officers, you have to fire them and prosecute them and get them out of the force, because that's there's no discussion that you have to do this. But it seems sometimes from the spread of information as if you have many more than there actually are. This is sort of one topic, I think, on the left. And on the right, of course, is this view that that the whole thing about COVID, lockdowns, masks, vaccinations, are mechanism of the government to suppress us and put us like in a totalitarian state. And every mistake that is sort of in hindsight comes out, maybe the lockdown was too strict, but we couldn't know this before. I mean, the typical case is that something is sort of is the best solution in this situation, and then 1 year later we find out it was not so problematic. We had the lockdown. You cannot sort of reevaluate on later knowledge what people have done. So this is sort of it's almost like a moral panic on the right-hand side. You mentioned the Querdenker movement, that the government uses the masks or the vaccination to control us or whatever, when every politician is, of course, struggling to enforce these laws or these measurements, knowing that it's annoying for most of the people, even those who agree with it. I mean, of course, it's annoying. For me, I agree with wearing a mask in public spaces, but it's absolutely annoying. I would like not to wear the mask. And it's, of course, it's a tough decision for a politician, but this is sort of the second. And these I saw very often in the last 1.5 years, but there are probably other examples. Do you have one in mind?
I think the main one that I really had was, like you said, the mask mandates, the vaccines. One thing that I can mention is that, at this point, people have been vaccinated now, and so we forget what it felt like 2 years ago when we weren't vaccinated. And so people have very strong feelings about what the government should or shouldn't have done, being completely forgetful of the circumstances that were in place just 6 months ago. I think that's a type of bullshit on its own, right? That you have this sort of this amnesia for what things were like just 6 months ago, just a year ago.
Hindsight bias. So you have more information later, and you forget that you don't have the information, and you can only judge an action by the information given at this moment. So you had certain preferences and desires to protect the society, and you had certain knowledge that the disease is contagious, and then you started saying you shouldn't say hello with your hand. And later on we found out, no, it's aerosols, and the hand is almost never a pathway of infection. People, funnily enough, still say hi with their elbows or with their knuckles, and they don't give you the hand, although it's absolutely clear that if you wash your hands, there's no problem saying hello with the hand. Yeah, and then it's a bit stupid to do. I'm not too sure that's bullshit in any case. Sometimes it's just a very common bias or mental shortcut. I mean, the Kahneman has written the whole book on fast and slow thinking, and he says that we have these two systems. The fast system is sort of emotional, automatic, and fast. You make fast decisions, and the system 2 is sort of rational thought. It takes attention, it takes energy and time. And since we are sort of lazy, we tend to use always system 1 unless we have to use system 2, which is more effortful. And then, for example, if we park a car, we have to concentrate. But normally if we drive, sort of it's almost an autopilot if it's not sort of a complex situation. And I think the same happens with thought. If someone asks you, how were the measurements of the government? Was it okay? No, it was wrong. And you totally forget. You don't do the effort to put yourself in the situation 2 years ago.
I guess another sort of bullshit that's sort of currently in the airwaves is surrounding the Ukraine war, right? You're getting a lot of messaging from both sides about what's going on, about the intentions of various. I mean, there are people saying, for instance, that the landing in Hostomel Airport in the northwest of Ukraine in the initial invasion was just a feint. You know, they didn't ever intend to take Kyiv. They were just, it was a diversion, right?
Yeah.
You have sort of this sort of, I don't know if this is the sort of flavor that you're looking for, but it's certainly messaging that seems to be put out to distract from what's really going on.
Yeah, I mean, propaganda was always, since the first villages started to fight each other, they used propaganda to motivate their own people and to vilify the others. And truth in war, truth is not so important. It's more about motivation and about being in the right group. So of course you will find all kinds of disinformation, intentional and unintentional disinformation campaigns, and Russia does this almost out of tradition. I mean, they have meddled with elections and have people working to spread false news in the West. But I think we made the mistake to think that everything that comes now from the Ukrainian side is pure and correct and never has any twist to it. And of course, even if you're the wrongful victim of an invasion of a superpower, of course you will also use all means of communication, framing, and weaponized narratives, so to say, to get your idea across, to motivate your own people, to show the West what's going on. And so we have always to have a sort of a distance towards media, not only towards language, sentences, which can be true or false or bullshit, but also towards pictures and films. I didn't talk so much about this in the book, but I think it's clear that this is also a very effective mean to influence people, especially because pictures and film influence you more directly. They evoke emotions immediately, and it's harder to find the context. I mean, you can only if you change the perspective. Sometimes it looks as if this is horrible or this is justified. So this will all be used in information campaigns, and sometimes information campaigns have a strong emphasis on disinformation.
I want to ask you just one more question quickly, sort of off to the side, and then I want to wrap up just by asking you very quickly about the impact of bullshit on our society and sort of ways to counter it.
Yeah.
You just sort of made me think of language and symbols and their importance. So in particular, how important it is to control language in the discourse. So let me give you some examples, and these aren't necessarily related. They're just there's some that are sort of outside of the culture and ones that may be closer to the German story. So for example, we restrict the use of words like the N-word.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one thing. Then there's the use of pronouns. And then an example that's sort of maybe closer to you, but it's not language so much as symbolism, is in Germany rather, if you did the Hitlergruß, the Nazi salute, in the wrong place, you might get beaten up and it's illegal, right? So I guess the question I want to ask is, how do we know when it's okay to restrict language? Like, under what circumstances is it okay to place these sorts of restrictions?
Yeah, I think it's a bit a new topic, but I think it's typically the topic of freedom of speech, and freedom of speech never meant, not even when John Stuart Mill formulated it in his work on liberalism, that you can say whatever you want to say. And the typical limitations to freedom of speech are if what you do is harmful. John Stuart Mill calls it the harm principle. So if what I'm doing with speech, or more broadly with symbols of all kinds, if this is harmful to anyone, I shouldn't do it, and it can be prosecuted like the Hitlergruß in Germany. It's a felony. So, but what are examples for harmful speech? I cannot reveal personal private data about someone. It can harm this person. I'm not allowed to shout fire in a theater because it can cause a mass panic. I'm not allowed, at least in Germany, I think in the US the same, I don't know about Australia, excite violence. So this is, if I say, let's go and kill these people over there, this is of course a free expression of my view. But if the consequences are harmful, I'm not allowed to do this. And in Germany, for example, denial of the Holocaust is also it's also considered harmful. And insults are even fined. I mean, there's a sort of range of, for smaller ones like idiot, you pay 200 euros.
Really?
And then it goes up. If it's idiot might be even, you have to ask a lawyer, idiot might be even so lexicalized and so common that you don't have to pay. But if you find stronger words, there's a sort of amount of money you pay, and the stronger the word gets, the higher.
I didn't know that.
The higher the money is. If you have, of course, you need
proof
and witnesses, but in principle it's possible. And but then there's a whole discussion whether, apart from these cases, there are still words or expressions that are harmful you shouldn't use. And I think there are different effects sort of, or factors sort of converging into this, you might call it political correctness idea. So I think one is the tradition of the left that is sensitive to harm, and from Marx on, via Adorno and the critical theory, Foucault, and other movements in the sort of intellectual left, the idea was first to help those people who are disadvantaged and give them better material conditions. So Marx was about the class fight, the class struggle of the working class, and they should get more rights and more shares from their work. And then there were sort of there's a whole tradition of fighting against material injustices. And the more the societies became welfare states, the less cases you could find of really sort of very clear cases of super evil injustices. Of course, there's still inequality and there is a lot of injustice in the world, but it became less and less. People became more similar to each other, the chances were better, the education system is better. So there is a tendency then in the intellectual left discourse to focus more on symbolic and cultural harm, not so much real material harm, which is also still a topic, but also focus on maybe the words or the way people are represented culturally can also be harmful. And I think it has a bit to do with this concept creep idea, because the less you find on the strong material side, the more you have to look at cases which are more subtle, or even in some cases maybe so extreme that you as an outsider would say, is that really harmful, or what is this about? So I think this is one movement. And then also the language can be should be inclusive. So the main idea is you shouldn't use certain words, for example, for a group that doesn't want these words to be used. So in Germany we have the word Zigeuner is gypsy, and there was never a study. There was one now conducted a couple of years ago, and if you ask Roma and Sinti, these are the two major groups, there are also others in Germany, is it okay for someone else to call you Zigeuner? I think about half of them says it's okay, and the other half says, no, I don't really like this. And some use it for themselves, others don't. So we have a change now in the German official way of talking about this. We don't use this term anymore as a general term. I don't think it was negative, as many would claim in the past, but it's not sort of okay anymore to use it. And this you can find in many languages in many countries. But then also you have a tendency, this is sort of about inclusion, but then you have also the tendency among the sort of academic elites to have their own vocabulary of exclusion. So you can use a specialized vocabulary, it used to be Latin, to exclude others who don't speak your language. And it's very interesting that in German, most of the terms now used especially in the social science and the humanities, in the discourse, which also sort of trickles down into a more public discourse via social media, are terms that nobody who's not familiar with these trends can understand. So we talked about mansplaining, gaslighting, intersectionality, transgressivity, the subaltern, alterität, I don't even know the English term for it. So there's a whole language and vocabulary of terms, epistemic injustice and so on, systematic or structural racism, redlining, racial profiling and so on. And many people don't even know what the terms mean. So in a sense, they're meant to draw attention to injustices, but as a side effect, or maybe partly as a main effect, they also create a certain language of moral superiority and exclusion for those who don't speak in these terms. And I think this, even though it's meant to be inclusive, people often don't realize that they use it exclusively. So Bourdieu said the same about taste. If you ask the upper class, what do they like? Yeah, abstract paintings, absurd theater, the Goldberg variations from Bach, but only played by Glenn Gould, the old recordings, not the new ones. So, and the people were honestly giving aesthetic statements, and they really believe it. It's not fake, but still, it's a mechanism to individualize yourself and exclude others and show that you belong to a certain group. And I think the same happens now with moral vocabulary. Although it was meant to be doing something good, it's now sometimes very exclusive, especially in Germany. Almost all the terms are now Latin or English. And large parts of the German population, about 80%, don't have a high school, don't have an academic education. Only 18% have academic education in Germany. And most of these 80% don't speak English so well to understand what ableism is. Even, I think, people in the academic circles don't know the terms, and they change very often at a pace that is almost impossible to follow. So it was okay to say Afro-Deutsch, Afro-German, but maybe 2 years later you have to say person of color. It's not okay to use the German term anymore. So it's really hard to follow. And then you have two groups. Maybe one group says it's okay to say it, the other doesn't. So it's a great confusion. I think this is one aspect. Also, again, signaling to your group that you belong to the group. You know the latest words, and the effect of those words is not so important anymore. So it's not really that you can show, if you don't use this word, harm is done, as opposed to the other word. So it's more about showing that you know the vocabulary.
It's really interesting when this sort of a cultural leap of terminology. One of the most, I guess, funny examples is with the BLM movement in England. People were at protests shouting things like "hands up, don't shoot" and things like this to police, where the police didn't have weapons. But it's always interesting to see, for example, German terminology disappearing in favor of English terminology as well. That's a little bit, it's a weird sort of colonialism that we have on our hands here.
Maybe it's colonialism, but also it could be, I call it the progressive marker. So if you want to show others that you're very progressive, you can be morally progressive, if you know the newest morals and nuances of social interaction. You can be aesthetically progressive if you know the newest art or movies or books, but you can also show that you're culturally progressive by using many English terms, because that's sort of the cosmopolitan lifestyle. So in my generation and even the younger generation, it's very common to use a mix of German and English words. And they used to make fun of it. When I was young, there were even songs created, sort of like a pigeon between German and English. So a very strange...
Denglish.
Yeah, Denglish. Yeah, exactly. And they made fun of it, but now it's quite common to show you're among the crowd. I think it's the same sort of signaling you do by using certain words. And interestingly, we talked about differences between male and females. There's a lot of studies that shows that language change is stronger in women than in men. And if you want to know how people speak in 10 or 20 years, you have to listen to the urban female language user. So young, educated women in cities have a very progressive, novel way of talking. There's one funny example. It's called vocal fry in American English. So the prime example is Britney Spears and Zooey Deschanel, and they speak like this with a very, if you have this sort of
the nasally,
and the sort of there's a the fluidity of the sounds is a bit the creaky voice. It's sort of a fry this. And this you can spread it to almost all young women speaking English in the US. And the opposite, it's called norm. It's the non-mobile older rural male. It's a term from linguistics. So if you want to know how people used to speak 40 years ago, you have to go to the countryside and speak with older men, because they don't change. They use the same vocabulary and intonation they used before. And I think this is sort of social contagion. It's not conscious, but it's a very strong mechanism that changes language just by you want to show or feel that you're connected to the cool group. and the progressive group.
And so women are young, educated, urban women are sort of the drivers of culture then?
At least the drivers of language change. Yeah.
It makes you wonder when people talk about whether we have a patriarchy or, if there are these sort of hidden drivers of where the culture's going. I wanted to jump back into the topic, just to end off, of bullshit and what impact it has on our society. So just two quick questions. The first is, what impact does bullshit have on democracy? And the second, they sort of can be coupled together. America is sort of an experiment, right? It's this diverse mixing pot, people call it, of cultures.
Yeah, it's not politically correct to say melting pot.
Okay, what's the correct
I think
term?
salad bowl is
okay,
more.
it's a salad bowl. It's of cultures, and so one thing I worry about is you mentioned that there's this divisiveness. So maybe in Western Europe, the division isn't real; it's just perceived. But in America, you sort of mentioned that it may be more real. Yeah. And so my question is this worrying moving forward for humanity if our key experiment of multiculturalism and getting on together in diversity, at least our key modern one, appears along certain lines to be fracturing?
Yeah. So I asked the first question first.
Sure.
So
I'll remind you if you forget.
Yeah, the bullshit. So the question about, is bullshit a problem? So if you do politics, very rough answer. If you do politics, you have to do two things. You have to make an assessment of how the world is like, so the facts, and then you need something like a normative agenda, like a political agenda, what you want to change. And if you don't have the facts about housing, taxes, income, employment, or climate change for that matter, you cannot address these problems by making changes in your politics because you don't have any basis on making things better. So even if you have imposing parties with different normative agendas, they have to agree upon basic facts. They have to agree upon this is the housing market, and then one party says we need stabilized rent, and the other says no, we need more. We have to build more houses, and the next says whatever. And in a world where bullshit prevails, if you cannot sort of agree on the facts and everybody's just saying what they want to say, you cannot really have a real democracy and a real state and change the conditions of the society. So I think this is sort of a very short and rough answer. And then the second question was about
our experiment.
The experiment. There's this recent book by Yascha Mounk. I don't know if you have seen it. It's actually called The Great Experiment, and it's about multiculturalism. And so many aspects in it, but one idea is that in overall it worked out pretty well. So imagine bringing people together from all over the world, different religions, and America is quite a successful country. And of course you have inequality and many problems, but on average, it seems to work quite well, although of course there are all these problems. So in a sense, I think it's an experiment that can work out pretty well. And maybe one polarization could be impediment towards this development. But I'd say on average, in many respects, if you look at the development almost all over the world is getting better in the moral and social sense. So we have not only higher life expectancy than 120 years ago, we have more democracies, although there's a dent within the last 20 or 25 years, but now still more countries are democracy than in the 80s. People have liberal outviews on the world. Poverty is getting smaller, although it's still pretty large overall, but every day 100,000 people escape extreme poverty, for example. And so in many respects, the world is getting better and the people are getting along. For example, in Germany, the homicide rate halved within the last 30 years. So there were about 5,000 manslaughter and homicide taken together in the 90s, and now it's 2,500. It's almost half of it. So people are more peaceful and can live together in a better sense. But also in a sense, you're right that I think America is in a way not a role model, but sort of a showcase experiment, because many countries now in the West, for example, like Germany, who used to define their national belonging by ethnicity, or at least by their sort of parental lineage, are now, if you look at them correctly, in fact, migration states. So where people in Germany almost more than 25%, I think 27 or so, now have a migration background, and it will increase. So I think most of the European countries will become like America, countries where a lot of immigrants come from all over the world, and they will be this melting pot, salad bowl, whatever metaphor you want to use for this situations, and we can sort of learn from the American experience. There's a sociologist, Putnam, I think Robert Putnam, and he made this one study that's very often cited, that in the beginning, when you have different groups, there's more rivalry, and people don't cooperate together. So that sort of situation is getting a little worse when you have multiculturalism. But then, in the end, after a while, it's getting above average. So he has these examples that, for example, in the US, most of the great successes in the sciences, the arts, Academy Award winnings, Grammys, National Science Foundation medals, and so on, go to a high proportion to immigrants. So it's really and trust, for example, in communities goes down if you have a lot of immigrants, but after a while gets up again. So we have to see how this experiment goes out. But I think it comes out. But I think there's a lot of evidence showing that it sort of can work well.
But you have to push through to the other side almost.
Yeah, you have to push to the other side, and of course you need education. I mean, you have to educate people in accepting the others. But even if you look at these, we talked about social dominance orientation. In German, it's called gruppenbezogene Menschenfeindlichkeit. So if people are derogative towards people who of other groups, say homosexuals or Jews or Muslims or women, foreigners, there's about like 15 groups who are typically discriminated by a small fraction of the society. And even these tendencies go down. People become more cosmopolitan, even on the right-hand side. So that's the overall trend. It's not an automatic trend, but I think it's there's some evidence that it will go on. And for example, a recent paper I just read, the attitudes towards racial equality got better even during the Trump era. So there was a trend that was not stopped or reversed by Trump, although he might have activated a small group on the right-hand side, but the overall attitude toward equality continued in the US.
Which is a very promising sign moving forward.
And which might show us, if we look at these papers, shows that we tend to over-exaggerate the differences by the media differences or by the Twitter shitstorms we see, and not by the available data from sort of solid social science research.
So on that topic then, what sort of legal restrictions or movements do you think should be made towards companies that sort of promote bullshit? So for example, Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or any social media site that promotes or earns money from bullshit, should there be sort of like with cigarettes or something where there's this tax associated with the harm that's caused to society?
Yeah. So of course the platform is responsible for what is shared on the platform. They are not responsible in the sense that they have shared it, but they have in Europe they are now forced to remove certain content that's hateful or discriminating against certain groups. But what can you do, like technically? That's another question. And there's some apps now that show you that a content could be bullshit or fake news. And I think this is a very good technical support, because it doesn't tell you it's fake, but it just reminds you, maybe you check the sources. And this is sort of just a little reminder that put on your attention, because when we have high attention and high alert, we are pretty good at distinguishing real news from fake news. Not all of them, but many of them. And we can check for the sources. But people, if they are sort of doom scrolling, the attention is sort of on half the level,
or lower,
or even lower, they tend not to do it.
Yeah.
So it's, I think such a reminder is good, but there was some ideas of having something like a ministry of truth.
That sounds a bit Orwellian.
Yeah. I mean, it was called differently, but if you put it Orwellian, you immediately see the danger that truth, or what is knowledge, is something that is not relative to different people. I mean, it's sort of either something is true or is false, but the way we find it out is sort of an interpersonal enterprise by using science and evidence and so on. And you cannot give this task to a single entity, let alone a state entity. I mean, you need as Habermas would say it, the public that exchanges ideas, and scientists and politicians, lay people, everybody has to participate in this public debate, and then sooner or later the important facts will come out and will be established, as opposed to the fake news. And this is why I think, and I sort of proposed this in my book, you have a certain responsibility as an individual. So you cannot wait for the state to solve the problem. And the idea of enlightenment was always that you, as an autonomous person, are responsible for your thoughts and your ideas and your beliefs. And you cannot exchange one dogma, the dogma of religion, of another dogma, the dogma of the state. So you have to think by yourself, as Immanuel Kant would have put it. And this is why I think we need more education in school and university of all these biases we talked about: hindsight bias, availability bias, confusion of causation and correlation. We need more knowledge of statistics. We need, in general, a more scientific outlook, because we are more confronted with data from the sciences. We still have a society that values humanities a bit more. We talk more about theater and literature and film and art, which is fine, but we also need an education, even if we are not working in the sciences, in scientific thinking. For example, in basic laws of statistics, we have to know that we cannot infer from anecdotal evidence to a whole theory. We have to know that one single example doesn't falsify a whole theory. One cold winter doesn't falsify the claim that there's man-made or human-made climate change. So these sort of, and I think all these biases, I mean, there are about 250 or so, which are now singled out in psychology. And you cannot learn all of them, but sort of the major biases, confirmation bias, for example, that you always want to confirm your views. And my side bias, you want to confirm them, especially if you have a certain ideological or political agenda. All these biases you have to reflect, otherwise you fall prey to these sort of mental shortcuts. And I call it bullshit resistance. That's sort of the name of the book. And I think this is sort of a package of critical thinking or media savviness. I mean, you could call it whatever you want, but in the end, it's sort of a toolbox that inoculates you against all kinds of bullshit.
Let me finish by asking you, what's your outlook? Do you have a positive view of where humanity is going? Do you think, we've talked about bullshit, we've talked about the problems that can arise with morality driving people against their individual ethics, but just generally speaking, when it comes to the way people interact with each other, the way the world is moving, whether we're going to be able to come together as humanity, and do you have a positive outlook?
It's a tough question. So for my nature, I'm not super optimistic, and the data show everything is getting better. But every time I look at the social media discourse and the way this sort of is then reflected in the media and in journalism, I start getting skeptical about whether it's getting better. So maybe it's getting worse within the next 10 or 15 years, and then after a while it's getting better. It's really hard to say. The one sort of silver lining for me is we are here at the University of the Arts, and I give seminars. And I always ask in the seminars, sometimes we also talk about digitalization or social media and exactly the questions you are asking and the effects. And many of the students around 20 don't use social media. And for me, it was really a surprise. I mean, it's it's also a bias because it's selection bias. I don't know whether it's representative for the whole student body. But my impression is many of the students are more aware of the dangers of social media or digital media in general, are more how could you say, more...
They're digital natives rather than...
but they're really like meta natives. So I'm in a sense, I mean, I'm not a digital native, I'm too old for that, but I grew up when I got my first computer when I was 12 or 13. So I also grew up with having access to computers, but when it comes to social media, I find myself sometimes, let me rephrase it, sometimes when I hear the 20-year-old students talking, I think they're more adult when it comes about the dangers and the effects of social media than I am, or most of the people of my generation, and even the millennials, they are now in their 30s. And I find it very strange. They say something like, if I have social media, I always compare myself to others, but I have projects and I cannot only focus on the projects if I don't do this. And it makes you unhappy, or you always want to present yourself. I want to work on something, I want to achieve something. So it's really interesting to see this outlook, because sometimes I wish I were so strong and determined as they are, when they say, as they present themselves.
That sounds like a positive outlook to it.
Good.
Philipp Huebl, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.